All right. Hey, everybody. My name is Max. I'm here today to talk to you about styled components, which is a new library me and a friend built just a few months ago. I work, in case you don't know me, I work as an open source developer at ThinkMill. ThinkMill, we are a full stack JavaScript agency, if I could skip my slides, which basically just means we do Node.js on the back end and tons of React and React Native on the front end and the mobile, respectively. We're based in Australia, in Sydney. I'm from Vienna. And I do open source, which means I maintain a lot of open source projects, some of which you might know. The most famous one is probably React Boilerplate, which is a React starter kit that now has over 10,000 stars on GitHub. I also maintain Keystone.js, which is a Node.js content management system, and Elemental UI, which is a React UI library that we built for Keystone. I have stickers for all of them, before I forget, and I've got React Vienna stickers with me. I forgot to, I'll give them to you. There's tons of stickers, all right? There's tons of stickers. I'll give them to you after the talk. When we built Elemental UI, it's sort of like, your standard React component library. We have buttons, we have modals, we have spinners, we have everything you need to build your application. And we built it because we needed something to build the Keystone admin interface with. And we tried to make something reusable, right? We tried to build something that helps you, and we try to build something that not only helps us, but helps everybody, right? That you can use in your applications, maybe change the styling a bit, change the behavior a tiny bit, but get sort of, very well done components out of the box. And the issue is, there is absolutely no good solution for styling React components at the moment. We are in what I like to call the component age, right? We've evolved beyond just documents on the web, right? In 1993, when we first got HTML, it was intended for scientific documents, right? And by now, we're building really complex applications that run in your browser. And the issue is, those two models don't fit together, right? We have documents that we can create, and then we try to cram applications into those documents, and it's horrible, right? It doesn't really fit, and we're working around it. And one of the ways that we've seen that works really well is by using components instead of just a document. Now, there's a bunch of things that have sort of shown this, right? Like, probably most of you use something like BEM or Suite CSS or object-oriented CSS, or, one of those conventions for writing CSS. And then you've got style guides and pattern libraries, and they're sort of considered best practices, right? And all of them sort of build upon not necessarily the term components, but upon small reusable things that you just compose together to build bigger things. As we started doing this whole component thing, we found some best practices, some things that work really, really well. The first is that you want to have focused components, right? Your components should be small. They should have a single purpose. They shouldn't have a huge API where you have 1,000 different options to make a component work exactly. It's just, tiny components, just a button that you can click, and that's it. Or a modal that just pops up, and that's it, right? Those components are tiny and focused. That way they're more testable and they're more understandable, because you don't need to dig through tons of documentation to understand. It's just a button, right? Just render a button and everything, it just works. The second thing is that these should be completely independent. Completely independent. Your button, if you change something in your button, that shouldn't change the way the header behaves or looks, right? Just because I say our main color of the button background is now green instead of blue shouldn't mean that the header now has a 3-column layout instead of a 2-column layout or something like that, right? Our components should be contained and focused. They should do one thing, and they should do it really, really, really well. And then the third thing that we've sort of found, especially in the React ecosystem, is that we should split smart and dumb components, or container and presentational components, or whatever you want to call them, right? Have components that just care about how things work, which is the containers, which is, they manage data. They get some data, they fetch some data maybe, and then they format it and render some presentational components, some dumb components based on the data that they got. And those presentational components, they don't care about the data. They don't care about anything. They're just the buttons, right? The buttons that render just a tiny bit of text. They don't care about what API you fetched, how the data comes in, what format. It doesn't care, right? It's just a button. So by splitting this, if you imagine like a tree hierarchy of your components, you get these layers of data management, and then these layers of just styling and really dumb components that just render some HTML, right? And it's really easy and nice to work with, because you know where you need to go. Your backend developer comes to you and says, hey, we've changed the API format slightly because it's more performance, so you need to update the front-end application. You just go, okay, I'll just take a look into my containers. Or if your designer comes to you and says, hey, we've changed the entire styling, right? The layout's now different and the colors, you know where to go to your components. You don't need to change the containers, right? Those just work, right? You're just changing the styling, or if your backend developer comes to you, just the behavior, just the data fetch. Now, the issue is that styling isn't very nice, right? CSS wasn't made for components, right? CSS inherently wasn't made for components. It was made for just styling some titles and some text, right? So as we've started building these bigger and bigger applications and more people have started using React, we've also discovered some best practices around styling. The first one is that we have single-use classes, right? If you have a button class, that button class should only ever change what the button looks like, right? Because you change the button color shouldn't mean, right, as I said, shouldn't change the header layout or something, right? The button class should just be used once, because as soon as you use it more than once, you're running into problems, right? And maybe some, you have these developers, I'm like that sometimes, where I see a class and I think, oh, that's perfect for my use case, and it's a button class, and I'm thinking, oh, the header needs to have a blue background, and the button has a blue background. I could just use that class name. Oh, that's dry. That's very good. But then you run into really bad problems because you'll forget about that. And then a month down the line, you change something about your button, and suddenly your header changes. And you're like, what? Where's that connection even happening? So in component-based systems where you have these tiny, focused, independent components, it makes a lot of sense to just use every class once. That way you can never run into those sorts of bugs. And the other thing is that we use components as styling constructs. Instead of having, how do I explain this? I forgot what my example was for this point. But anyhow, use components as styling constructs. Doesn't matter what I wanted to say here. Oh, no, actually. No, this ties back into the smart and dumb thing. Because instead of having just random huge components that do everything at once, you have components that care about things like layout, right? You have a grid component. You have a text component. You have a header component, right? All of those primitives are defined in components. And that way, you have single-use classes because you only use the classes to style those components once. You get the single-use classes, and then you use components to style your application. So you can compose them together. You can apply math to them, which you just can't in CSS. Somebody called Michael Chan at Chantastic on Twitter posted a great article called Style Components. Not styled components, style components. It's a Medium. And he has this great quote in there, which is, if you're writing React, you have access to a more powerful styling construct than CSS class names. You have components. And I think this very much is the crux of why we're trying to put styles into JavaScript. Because CSS is a great language for styling, right? It's made for the purpose. But the issue is that it doesn't work with logic at all. And we try to cram logic into a language that wasn't made for it. But what if we just did it the other way around? What if we just put CSS and put it into JavaScript, right? And that's why people have started co-locating their styles in the JavaScript files, because you get access to much more powerful, much more information, and you can just apply so much more power to your styles, right? The issue is we have all of these best practices, but it's really hard to enforce them, right? You need to have code reviews, and you need to have developers looking at the things other developers do, and need to think about, okay, we were trying to build this. Like, two people have to think about the same thing, thinking, we were trying to build this. Okay, so we could have a container there. So this could be a component, but then this could be a container again. And it's like, if you need to have code reviews to make that work, right? If you want to enforce this, there's just no way around it, right? You need to have two people thinking about, okay, how could we structure this? That was true until now, and that's sort of why we built styled components. Style Components is a new library to style your React application, surprisingly. It was made by me and Glenn Madden. You might know Glenn from CSS modules. He's one of the creators of CSS modules. And Style Components is kind of like the step afterwards. It sort of takes the best ideas of CSS modules and makes it even better. The one really weird idea that we have is that we remove the mapping between styles and components, right? Your styles are your components. What does that look like? So the first thing we do here is very interesting. We import style from styled components, right? Nothing fancy going on. But then we start. We say const title equals style.h1, and then with a backtick. And this is already very weird. Now this style.h1 thing, that's a function. That's just a function. And what this does is it returns a React component that renders an h1 HTML tag. So this title variable that we have here is now a React component. And this title React component that we have will just render an h1 HTML tag. And then we pass in some styles into these two backticks, right? In this case, we want to say our title React component should have a font size of 1.5 em, should be aligned to the center, and should have a color of pale violet red, right? Just CSS. We're just styling our title component. But there's no class names anymore, right? Your components are now your styling construct. This weird backtick notation, by the way, is tag template literals. Before you're thinking, oh my god, I have to use Babel for something, no, this is just JavaScript. That's a new JavaScript feature. When Glenn first showed me the first iteration of what was going to become styled components, we already had these backticks in there. And I looked at it and I was like, holy cow, what the hell is that? How does that even work? But as it turns out, this is actually an ES6 feature that's been in the language, and you can just use it. It's just calling the function slightly differently, which enables us to add some features that we will see very soon. So anyhow, the title variable here is now a React component that renders an h1 tag with certain styles applied. And similarly, this wrapper variable down here renders a section HTML tag with a color of pale violet red again, some padding, 100% width and height, and a background of papaya width. Now, these are just React components, so you can just render them like any other React component, right? We just render our wrapper, we render our title, and then we put some text into it. And surprisingly, that renders an h1 tag and the wrapper a section that have the styles applied, right? Very surprising. Now, something you might have noticed here is that you're writing actual CSS, but you're writing that actual CSS in your JavaScript files. The thing is, because we let you write actual CSS in a JavaScript, there's no limit. This isn't inline styles, right? Some people tend to think that styled components, oh, that's inline styles. We're attaching some styles directly to DOM nodes, so there's no support. No, it's just CSS. So you can have everything. We support media queries, nesting, whatever CSS supports, we support, because this is just CSS, right? There's nothing fancy going on. We literally just take that and inject it into the DOM as a style tag. Now, in this case, we have a color changer component, right? Which again is just a section. It has a background of papaya width, and any h2 tags within this component will have a color of pale violet red. And then when we're over a certain minimum width, in this case 875 pixels, the background will change from papaya width to medium sea green. I know, it's very fancy colors. This, as you might expect, does exactly the thing you expect, which is it changes its color as soon as it has a certain size. It's just CSS, right? There's nothing fancy going on here, it's just media queries. It gets really interesting when you think about React components, because you can adapt React components with properties, right? You might have a button that has a primary state, right? Where it is more important, where it has another color or is maybe bigger, right? And this is sort of a common API in the React world. How do you do this with styled components? Because you can't actually access the render function. You can just say style.something, style.button, and that's it. And this is where tag template literals come into play. So what we allow you to do is we allow you to interpolate a function into this template literal. And into this function, we then go and inject the properties that you pass to the components. So in this case, this is a button component. And this button component essentially says, if the primary prop is set the background color to pale violet red and the color to white. Or if it isn't set, if it's not a primary button, set the background color to white and the color to pale violet red, right? And we can do this because it's a tag template literal. And so normally in JavaScript, when you have template literals, which is just two backticks, right? And you interpolate something into that string, what happens is JavaScript goes ahead, takes your string, and to-stringifies everything you've interpolated. So in this case, if you would pass a function into a template literal, what would happen is we would then get the literal to-stringify function, which is totally not helpful because you can't stringify complex functions, right? That doesn't work. And we would need to somehow detect functions or something. But with tag template literals, what JavaScript does is it goes ahead, takes that whole string, and gives you the string, and then the interpolation is a separate thing as a variable. And then it gives you the next part after the interpolation. And it, sort of how to explain this better. Let me show this on screen actually, because it's probably easier. So the first thing we get as styled components, as the library, is we get everything up to the background thing. We get a string that just says background colon space. And then we get another string that says font size 1em, margin 1em, blah, blah, blah. And these two interpolations we don't actually get as a string, we get them as actual functions, which allows us to pass in the properties and execute the functions that you interpolate. That was a pretty bad explanation, but if you want to learn more about tag temperatures, I just released a blog post today that you can read about them. So anyhow, we have this button component, which has a primary prop, and which has a primary prop. And as you might have guessed, if you set the primary prop, it's a more important button. It has a pale violet red background color, which is pretty cool. Now, because we built this with the sort of elemental UI use case in mind, right, where we had this component library, we still have this component library, and all the other methods of styling that people use in the React world, they don't work very well for third-party components. CSS modules, for example, works really, really well for styling applications. But if you try to theme something that was built with CSS modules, you're going to have a lot of pain. Because you're going to ship something to NPM, and you might ship like a CSS file. And then people have to use Webpack and import the CSS file so Webpack can take it, and then they might have to use post-CSS so you can put variables in there, and it's a pain in the ass to use. Or you use something like inline styles like Radium, but then you use inline styles, which is a pain as well. And also they don't have theming support. So styled components actually has theming built into the library. Now, what this looks like is this. We have this theme provider component, which you can pass a theme to. So you say import theme provider from styled components, nothing fancy going on there. And then you specify some sort of theme, right? In this case, we just specify that the primary color should be pale violet red, but you can put anything in there, right? It's just JavaScript. And then you wrap your components in a theme provider. In this case, we are wrapping the entire app because we want the entire app to have the same theme, but you could wrap different parts of the application in different theme providers. So your sidebar could have a dark theme, and your main area could have a light theme, or something like that. And then how you adapt to that in your components? Well, we have these functions, right? And we just inject the theme into your styled components. So this props.theme thing now refers to the theme that comes from a high-up theme provider. This uses React's context feature to go all the way down the tree. Let's say you have two themes, right? You have a red theme and you have a blue theme. You can have two theme providers in the same app. You can have as many theme providers as you want in the same app, and everything just works perfectly fine. And the button will now adapt to the theme that it's wrapped into. And the interesting thing is, because it uses React context, it works like as many levels deep of components as you want. So even though this button is within 3 different levels of components inside the theme provider, it'll still get the theme. So you're now building your application with styled components, and we've also sort of covered the use case of third-party component libraries with styled components. But we were still kind of not 100% happy, because at ThinkMill, we build a lot of applications that have web parts and that also have React Native parts. And all the current libraries sort of do their own thing, right? React Native has this styling thing, which works perfectly fine, but then styling your web applications is entirely different. So with styled components, we have full React Native support, meaning that you can style no matter what part of your application you work in, you can just use styled components. It's always the same API. You don't have to learn anything new, right? It's just styled components all the way. What it looks like? Well, it just looks exactly the same, except you're importing from /native. So we go import styled from styled-components /native. And then you get access to the React Native primitives. So you say const wrapper equals styled.view, which is a React Native primitive, kind of like a div on the web. And then you just pass in your styles, right? It just works like React Native. And then, we have another component, which is just style.text, which is like a paragraph or a heading on the web. And again, we pass in some styles, right? And these are just React components, so you can render them in your React Native application. And surprisingly, they render in React Native. This is an actual screenshot from my phone. When we first got this working, and I opened it on my phone, I was like, holy cow, this is cool. Because I didn't believe we could get it working, but it actually works now, and it works really well. Now, the issue is, so there is one sort of slight problem with styled components, which is you're putting CSS into strings in JavaScript, right? That just sounds like a horrible idea. You lose a bunch of tooling because of that, right? So, for example, syntax highlighting isn't supported anywhere because the editor just recognizes it as a string. It doesn't recognize that it's CSS. So we built syntax highlighting support into Atom, Sublime Text, and VS Code. And we're working on WebStorm and Vim at the moment, and all the other editors will follow eventually. And another thing that we also kind of missed when writing styled components was linting. So we built a style lint processor that allows you to lint your styled component CSS. So what we have on the left here is just a styled component with some CSS that's very, very badly formatted. And then on the right here, we have a terminal. And what I'm doing here is just running style lint on my JavaScript file. And because we have this processor, stylint understands what the CSS is and what it looks like and tells you, hey, that's pretty badly formatted, you should fix this. And then you can go ahead and fix your CSS, make it look nice again, fix all the wrong values that you have, the white space issues, save it, run it again, and of course stylint doesn't complain. Now, using it is as simple as running npm install styled components. Right? There's nothing fancy going, oh, actually, wait, that's not a thing anymore. Sorry, yarn add styled components. And you can just use it in your applications right now. We're also on GitHub, github.com/styled components, surprisingly. So if you have any questions, if you have any ideas, go there, tell us what you think. And that's basically it. Thank you very much.